So would you tell us where you trained to be a liaison pilot and what that was like?
When I trained, well, I trained at Denton, Texas, and we flew L1s, 2s, and 3s, 4s. Not 1s, excuse me. That was later. 2, 3s, and 4s is what we had for training. And the only thing I flew in combat was the L4.
What was your favorite one?
What was your favorite plane? Oh, probably the L1. I had one of my, we were ferrying planes from the Chemsee to Frankfurt. People would turn them in at the base there at Chemsee, and then we'd ferry them to Frankfurt. And one of the mechanics said, "We've got a bunch of L1s that are marked salvage." He said, "If I put one together so it'll fly, will you fly it?" I said, "I will if you ride with me." And so he did, and we did, and I had my own personal plane for a while.
So how long did you train, and what did they train you to do?
Oh, I think the basic training was probably I can't remember how many hours. It wasn't a lot. I don't think there was 100 hours, like maybe 60. And then I went to Fort Sill for the advanced training, and got out of there in January of 4.
How did you get to England?
On the Queen Elizabeth, the original one, along with 20,000 other troops. You had bunk beds stacked 3 high, and you got 8 hours in a bunk bed, and that 2 other guys had 8 hours in the same bunk bed, so you didn't get to stay very long.
Did you know which unit you were going to be assigned to, or were you assigned to the unit when you arrived?
Well, it was quite a while before I got assigned to a unit, because we landed at the Firth of Clyde, and then I was in some replacement depots there in England, and then I went across to Lahore. I landed on Omaha Beach, but in September, not in June. And it was a little cleaned up by then.
Where did you first join your combat unit, and what do you remember for the first few weeks?
Well, I joined the combat unit in Holland, or the Netherlands, and they had both of their pilots shot down the same day. One of them was a crash and burn, and the other one was promoted they were staff sergeant pilots, and the other one promoted to a second lieutenant and sent back to Fort Sill to learn how to be an officer. Except when he got there, they assigned him to the flying school and as a tactics officer.
So you said you were in Holland? What kind of missions were you flying when you were there at first?
Oh, I don't remember much about those missions, but because we were firing on Aachen at the time. So, and another thing, our colonel had the observers that were with the units on the ground, they could be air observers, and so they would change every 2 weeks so they'd get flight pay as well.
You said you were firing at Aachen. Is that a city?
Yeah.
What about the, were you like flying circles over the city shooting at targets, or tell me about that?
No, I don't. The only thing I remember about that was our Jeep driver was going with some girl that lived in Aachen, and he took her home on the Jeep, and he came back at night with the lights on the Jeep, and we said, "What on earth did you turn the lights on for?" And he said, "Well," he said, I sat down and I heard machine gun fire, and I asked her if that was American, and she said, "No, the Americans haven't been here yet." And so he said, I went down and jumped in the Jeep and turned on the lights, and I figured they'd say, "Let that fool go, he'll kill himself."
So where'd you go from Aachen?
What?
Where did you go from Aachen?
Oh, we went to Belgium from Aachen, and we covered a wide front. We had a task force that was composed of our battalion of M7s and 2 squadrons of light cavalry, and it was called Task Force Dolph. And we were covering a wide area there in Belgium, and our colonel would take the guns, and instead of having 3 6-gun batteries, he'd have 9 2-gun batteries and register each one of them so they'd make them think that we had a lot of artillery there. However, that was the same. We were replaced by 2 divisions, the 99th and the 106th, and those 2 divisions took the brunt of the Bulge attack. And later I saw one of the officers back at school, and I laughed when he told me he was in the 99th. And he said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "We were the first full combat division to reach Berlin, as prisoners, of course."
So let me see if, I think I understand what you were saying, but I'm not sure if the rest of the audience does. When you talk about registering fire, I think what I've read is that a lot of times, first thing in the morning, the Piper Cub would go up, and they would aim a gun at a particular target, and they would walk the shells to make sure they were going to hit that target. And that would be called registering the fire, and then they would know where to aim the guns later based on where that hit, right?
Well, if you had a target, the observer would send the coordinates to the gun and for them to fire on, and then if it wasn't quite accurate, they adjust it from there.
So basically, if you fired one shell and it didn't hit the target, you would keep telling them to move it until they did hit the target, and then they could base all their measurements off of that later on, right?
Well, our colonel said, you better be hitting the target on the 2nd round, or else he'll be gone.
Gotcha. So tell me about what you remember from the time of the Battle of the Bulge.
Well, we didn't fly on the 16th of December because the weather was too bad. And most planes didn't fly on the 17th either, but we did, as we didn't have anybody else tell us not to. So we flew on the 17th, and that was the biggest day I ever had. I flew 6 hours on that day, and we had targets all day long. Let me explain, we were supporting the 78th Division. The 78th Division Air Officer would not allow their planes to go past the front lines. They were only used if their ground observer couldn't see far enough and they could go up in the air and observe for them. Kind of pink waist, I guess. Anyway, on that day, we not only fired our own battalion, we fired the 155s of the 78th Division. We fired long toms from the Corps, and we also fired 240s from Army. And that was the only day that we fired anybody but our own battalion. But it was really nice, where you've been watching 105s, to see those 240s. They do make a difference. And we always flew across the front lines. We figured you'd find targets in the enemy territory. You don't find them in the friendly territory. And so we were always flying in front of the front lines. I like to keep the target between me and our guns, because that way I wasn't going to get shot down by our own weapons. But that particular day was the highlight of the whole war for me.
So I've been told that you actually helped participate in destroying a German tank column. And this is one of the German tank columns that was trying to break through to the rear of the American lines and wipe out the supply lines in the back, right?
Yeah. Well, the German report said there were between 40 and 50 vehicles in this column. And they were in kind of a deep depolade when we saw them, with forest on both sides of the road. And so they couldn't really go anywhere except forward or backward. And my observer registered on the front vehicle, and then he registered on the rear one, and then he told them to just fire for effect between those two. And every once in a while they'd throw in a white phosphorus shell to catch anybody that was trying to run away.
And so there are accounts that this German tank column was pretty much wiped out by the fire from the L4s.
Yeah, the German report said that that was truly the end of the Bulge as far as they were concerned, our destruction of that column.
What else could you tell us about how you would set up a field, what you would operate from, and what you were worried about as a liaison pilot?
Well, I don't know about that. The first field I picked from the air, it was the pasture field, and it had a road, a road running through it. But over here, that'd just be a little minor thing. And when I landed on there and hit it into that road, the road dropped about 2 feet, and so I got the landing gear and the prop on that one. And if you used a lane for 400 years, I guess you'd have a deeper road.
So did you get a replacement Piper Cub after that?
Oh yeah, we had spare parts to repair it. It didn't take long.
What were your quarters like? Did you sleep in a tent all the time? Were you well fed? Who traveled with you, that kind of thing?
Well, most of the time we ate with the headquarters battery if they were close enough. otherwise, we carried enough supplies to fix our own. And sometimes, I remember one time that the observer was carrying his carbine, and he shot a deer, and we gave the ground crew the coordinates, and they came and dressed it out, so we had fresh venison for a while.
You're saying he shot it from the airplane? You're saying he shot it from the airplane?
Yeah. Yes, he shot it from the airplane.
Do you remember any particular missions that you were ever in view of enemy aircraft, anti-aircraft fire shooting at you?
Well, I remember one time the announcement came over the air that there were 11 ME-109s in the area. And I thought, yeah, I've never seen that many in one group. But I was wrong, and there were, and one of them decided he'd try to get me, but I kept turning inside of him until I got down in the treetops, and he made one pass and took off.
So wait, you outfoxed a German ME-109 pilot in a Piper Cub?
I guess that's what you call it. I got away anyway.
So what he's talking about is something that's interesting. I've never heard this particular part of what he said before. The better units started learning that they would actually try to have spotters, and they would try to warn the Cub pilots if they saw German fighters approaching, because the Germans kind of had a bounty on these guys' heads.
Yeah, that's true. You know, I don't know who made these reports to us, but they were welcome.
What else would you like the people here to remember about the liaison pilots and about the artillery units? What would you have everybody remember?
No, some of the fine points, I was on winter maneuvers up the northern peninsula of Michigan with the 76th Division. And, okay, with the 76th Division, and we had skis on the planes there. I wish we'd have had them in Germany in December, but we didn't. And we had the skis on the plane, so we used the lakes up there to land on, and one of them was by a school, and of course they let all the kids out because they hadn't seen a plane before, so that was interesting.
Does anybody else want to ask some questions?
So when you were in Denton, what did you learn at Hartley Field?
Why don't you come through?
Yeah.
Thanks. I'll try not to monopolize time, but I have like 3 questions. First is, when you were in Denton, did you train at Hartley Field? Is that where you trained, or do you? Okay. So yeah. So where did they have you staying? Where were you bunked?
We stayed at what was then called North Texas State College, which is now Northern University, but then it was North Texas State College, and the men's dorm was empty because they were all gone.
So, and then to take it to the other end, where were you when the war ended?
I was in Písek, Czechoslovakia, and we met the Russians there. That was the dividing line was supposed to be the Danube River, and that's right there by Písek. And some of the Russians come over and occupied the town on our side, and our colonel took the 18 M7s and surrounded the town along with the 3 tanks that we had too, because the port observers had a tank, and so he surrounded the town. He went in and told the commander, if you aren't gone by daylight, I'm gonna level this down. And they understood that, and they were gone.
And my last question is, did you continue with your interest or flying after the war was over?
Well, I stayed in the reserve for another almost 20 years, so I had a total of 22 and a half years time, both active and reserve.
And so were you flying the current observation aircraft post-war, or did they have you flying something else in the reserve? Or did you fly at all?
Yeah, I stayed active as a pilot, and the Army had they leased planes for me to fly. And one of them was the 195 Cessna. One of them I liked really well was a Piper Comanche, and it had dual instruments and autopilot and all that sort of thing, and had tip tanks on it, so it'd go a little faster and farther.
Well, thanks a lot for answering my questions, for coming out and sharing with everybody, especially the little folks here today. We really appreciate it.
Do you have a question?
Yes.
I heard you talk about encountering the ME-109s and outturning one or several, but were there any other sightings of German fighters that you can recall?
No, I don't. Maybe 1 or 2 aircraft, but never more than that, except that one time, and which I didn't believe because I've never seen it that many. But there were.
One last question. I noticed the L-5 has a cockpit that's got plexiglass, so the pilot can actually look back and see who's chasing him. Did you have that when you were encountering the ME-105s, or did you have mirrors?
I only flew the L-4 in combat, and I don't know.
No mirrors? Cover your 6?
The L4 had a full canopy, so you could see behind yourself. Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming out. It's really our honor to have you here today.